The Ursa Mini Pro 12K is not what I was expecting to come next from Blackmagic design. It certainly doesn't represent what much of the Ursa camera community has been asking and hoping for in the next generation iteration. So what can we read into this announcement and these ridiculous camera specs? 12K for 10K? Let's get into it. I'm late to the party with this vid, but in case you somehow hadn't heard, Blackmagic have announced their next Ursa. Now, I'll be the first person to say cameras are way more than specs, but that said, here they are. 12K resolution at 60 frames per second, plus 8K, 6K and 4K super sampled Blackmagic RAW without cropping at 110 frames per second. It seems they designed the sensor around Blackmagic RAW or vice versa to make this possible. This is perhaps the trump card of this camera. Instead of being a Bayer pattern sensor with more green pixels than blue or red, according to Blackmagic design, the new 12K sensor has equal amounts of red, green and blue pixels and is optimized for images at multiple resolutions. I'm not a maths person, but basically because the sensor is designed the way it is, Blackmagic can give us RAW with super sampling, lowering the resolution in camera without cropping. For many, this would likely be an 8 and 6K camera, one would think. They're giving us new Generation 5 color science with an improved film curve to maximize dynamic range and color reproduction, 14 stops of dynamic range, notably a stop under the claimed 15 stops on the Ursa G3. New variations on Blackmagic RAW compression with the additions of 18:1 and Q1 and Q3 in the constant quality department. A Super 35 sensor, not full frame, is essentially bucking the alive and kicking full frame trend, the likes of which almost every other camera manufacturer has jumped on, from Canon to Sony to Red to Arri and so on. My first thoughts as a small video business operator and corporate and commercial shooter were, what the hell? Like, who needs 12K? No one is asking for this. Well, no one in my market that I know of. It's interesting that this camera comes standard with a PL mount, not EF or E mount or RF, and I think that is really important, and I'll come back to it later. Not too long ago, I made a video about what I'd like to see in the next gen Ursa as well as the next Pocket. I also posted a poll in the Ursa G3 Facebook group asking for opinions on the top requested features and improvements. Mine were number 1, improved IR protection, number 2, improved quality control for greater reliability, number 3, autofocus, number 4, a full frame sensor, number 5, an increase in dynamic range, followed by a better performance across the ISO range at higher ISOs, and maintaining 100 to 120 frames per second with no crop, so a nice fast sensor read speed. The Facebook group wanted to see dual native ISO, and I thought this was definitely coming, an increase in dynamic range, an improved optical low pass filter with better IR protection. Number 4, maintaining 120 FPS full sensor readout. Those were followed by full frame and a body change. Some people aren't super stoked with the current Ursa body. I actually think it's quite good, other than a few minor things. But what have we got? Number 1, Super 35, not full frame. An apparent downgrade in dynamic range with 14 stops claimed, lower than the G2's 15 stops. The same camera body, 110 frames per second, so not 120. And that's in 8K, but that's close. That's a pass, I think. No autofocus and no dual native ISO. That's in the Pocket 6K, for example. Everything else with regards to IR protection, quality control, and noise and color performance at higher ISOs remains to be seen. As I said before, it comes standard with a PL mount, the standard in TV and cinema production for higher quality cinema glass from Cooke, Arri and Zeiss and everyone. Blackmagic cameras are not synonymous with cinema, television production, high-end commercials or VFX work. Not to say that they are never utilised there, they are in my opinion perhaps criminally underutilised there, but clearly with 12K and true super sampled 8K, that's a market they're looking to muscle in on. This camera isn't geared towards those of us that freelance or run small video video production companies. It's just that Blackmagic's pricing, because of their mission to allow the highest quality video to be affordable to everyone, which I very much believe they believe in, that means this insane camera is in many of our price ranges, being cheaper than a C300 Mark III. But I think Grand Petty, Blackmagic CEO, made it clear in his live stream, this is targeted at the high end, at high-end DPs doing high-end narrative and commercial work. Now, those of us running smaller operations may very well be able to afford it at 10K US, but it's not really designed for us, and we don't really need it. But do we want it? Well, that's a whole other thing. Of course we do, but as a very happy G2 and Pocket 6K owner, I'm not snapping at this just yet, nor is Blackmagic trying to get me to. I'm not their target market. The PL mount 12K Super 35 bucking the full frame trend to me represents a dedication to making the most of the vast array of vintage and modern S35 glass and a shift in customer focus. In many ways, Super 35 better suits the targeted focus pulling in narrative work often shot between T2.8 to 5.6, rather than us content shooters running around with our lenses wide open seeking the shallowest depth of field possible, hence a strong trend towards full frame. I'd made my assumptions and hopes for the next gen Ursa based on my wants and needs as a small business operator. However, this camera shows Blackmagic has really had a vision beyond its current main user base. This camera could be a beast for high-end VFX work. It's not for the event or the corporate video shooter, although pulling 8K stills from 120 FPS footage would be awesome for some clients. So that has my attention for sure. I think particularly for wedding shooters, where I know autofocus runs rife, but being able to pull super sampled 8K stills out of your 110 frames per second B-roll could be a thing of beauty and a great product to offer. Not to mention shooting a 12K ceremony wide that you can crop in on to your heart's content. All this said, I used to shoot 4K slow motion on a Scarlett W that ended up on posters and billboards, perhaps that was a stretch. This isn't. Ultimately, this camera and sensor, which appears to have been years in development, speaks to the power of Blackmagic RAW. The way that codec has been designed has for the first time made it possible to super sample down-res in camera without cropping and retain the ability to change ISO and white balance in post. That's huge. That's the trump card of this camera. For those of us whose first thoughts were enough with the Ks already, 2K and 4K look great. Improve the sensor speed, color reproduction, and dynamic range. Yes, it's a 12K camera, but it's also a true 8K camera, a 6K camera, a 4K camera at 110 frames per second. You don't need to use the 12K, but it's there if you want it, and the camera is only 10K US. I love not cropping for 100 frames per second shooting with the Ursa G3. I'd see myself shooting mostly 8K or 6K depending on the project with this new camera. However, and this is a big however, I'm really looking forward to seeing the tests roll in on what, if any, discernible differences there are in aliasing, moire, or any artifacts when viewing the footage back in 4K from a 4K, 6K, 8K, or 12K recording. If the only loss is resolution without other image degradation, I think Blackmagic have a winner here, providing the thing is reliable. I already think Blackmagic have excellent skin tones and color with Gen 4 color science and the Ursa G3, so I'm very excited and interested in seeing what this new sensor design has to offer. So where to from here? What do we need to see and know now? Number one for me, how is the IR protection on the sensor? How improved is it over the G2? 14 stops of dynamic range. So is that less than the G2's claimed 15 or a more accurate measurement? Remembering the ARRI Alexa only claims 14 stops. How does this camera perform at 800 and higher ISOs? Not just noise, but how is the color and how does it change at higher ISOs? When does it break? As I mentioned before, I really want to see how the 4K, 6K, 8K, and 12K edits together for 4K distribution, differences in aliasing, moire, and artifacts, if any. I want to see what some of the talented DPs and storytellers out there who have it are going to do with it, and what they feel this camera offers them as a tool compared to other tools already at their disposal. What's special or unique about this image? This was an unexpected move to me. I think because I didn't see the high end as being Blackmagic's primary focus. I thought they were not content, but perhaps a little bit resigned to staying in the mid-range. That sounds condescending, and I don't mean it that way. I own and adore their cameras. Anyway, clearly Grant and the team have a vision for their products to serve higher end markets in a way they don't currently, and I couldn't be more excited for them. Blackmagic RAW and this new sensor tech may very well prove to be a disruptor that we look back on in the future as a turning point in motion picture capture, much like the Red One and the 5D Mark II before. As this is the Ursa Mini Pro 12K, not the Ursa Mini Pro G3, my hope is that we perhaps see another option, a G3 model down the road that looks to serve the indie and content production markets. Maybe with autofocus, maybe full frame with 6 to 8K resolution, and the vital improvements to inbuilt IR protection. Please, 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 Blackmagic, protect your sensors better from infrared. The colors are so great. Please look after them. But with 12K resolution for 10 grand, with 4, 6 and 8K 110 FPS no crop raw recording, I do believe Blackmagic Design have done something special here, and I did not see it coming. Did you? What do you hope for in a next gen Ursa from Blackmagic? What do you think about this announcement? Are you considering pulling the trigger on one? And what are you wanting to see from this camera now that you know about it? Please let me know in the comments below. Till next time, good luck on your filmmaking journey.